Well, let's start with these two executive orders, if we could, and maybe you could help us understand what you're going to set out to accomplish here over the next 90 days.
Well, these executive orders have two separate but very much related purposes. Fundamentally, enforcement is a very, very primary objective of this administration in trade, and then improving exports is the other very important thing. How do these two fit together? The omnibus order, the 90-day investigation, will be the first truly systematic investigation that we're aware of into country by country, product by product, why are we having trade deficits? And hopefully that will lead us to the solutions. How do we reduce the deficits, preferably by increasing our exports? So that's the thrust of the 90-day study. And we may very well come with some interim findings. It's not required that we use the whole 90 days. The second order is the one related more to enforcement, in that when I got here, I was horrified to learn that there are literally billions of dollars of countervailing duties and anti-dumping fines that have never been collected. And the reason they were never collected, for the most part, is that the foreign exporters are very clever at setting up shell companies here, so when we do levy the fine, there's no capability to pay. So what this second order will do is impose a requirement for letters of credit or cash or insurance company bonding to be put up so that there is a responsible party when the fines are levied. So it really is to help make enforcement effective.
Let's take those in kind. Let me ask you first of all here about critics who say that you're focused too much on trade deficits. What do you say in response to that?
Well, I don't know what they mean by focusing too much. I realize there are some folks who think that trade deficits are not harmful. Well, to those people, I would ask a simple question. Do we agree that trade exports and a trade balance favorable has been an important factor in propelling China's growth? If we do, then I would like someone to explain to me, how can it be the case that both surpluses and deficits are good?
On the issue of enforcement, do you intend to continue to work within the strictures of the WTO? What's your message to the World Trade Organization going to be?
Well, the World Trade Organization has been in being for a very, very long time, and it's quite conceivable that there's some modernization needed of some of their processes, also of their mindset. If you read their annual report, it describes almost universally anything by way of countervailing duties or any other sort of trade remedy as protectionist. It doesn't focus on the idea that the reason that there are more trade cases is that there are more countries practicing violative behavior. So I think their attitude, their mindset could use a little refinement.
We're expecting a review of China's market economy status under the WTO here in a matter of days, I gather. What can we expect from that report, from that review?
Well, I don't think it's quite that the WTO is going to review it. I think what it is China has brought an action seeking to be granted normal market status. They brought two litigations, one against the U.S. and one against the EU. The one they're propelling forward the most is the one against the EU. Apparently they think maybe they have a little better shot because the EU rules and the way that they've gone about it is a little bit different from the way the United States has. But whether or not one is a non-market economy is a very important question because it dictates the ease and the quantity of fines and countervailing duties that you can impose on that country. So it's a very, very important item, and it will have a lot to do with a lot of people's trade balances.
When the president heads to Mar-a-Lago next week to meet with the Chinese president for the first time, how big an agenda item is trade going to be, and what are you setting out, hoping to accomplish in Mar-a-Lago next week?
Well, those negotiations as to the content, the exact content, are still underway, but suffice it to say that I will be an active participant in the conference next week.
The President characterized those meetings as very difficult. Are there particular things that pose particular difficulties? In other words, are there things that you know you'll broach and will create some controversy?
Well, my view is that the United States is about the least protectionist of the major countries, and that China is one of the most protectionist. There's an inherent clash between those two, even though China uses a tremendous amount of free trade rhetoric. We'd like the rhetoric and the behavior to become more congruent.
Do you expect that currency is going to be something that comes up while you're down there?
If it does, it will come up with Steve Mnuchin, our Treasury Secretary. Currency manipulation is the province of Treasury, not of Commerce.
Very good. Let me ask you how inchoate this administration's trade policy is. Peter Navarro this morning, the director of the National Trade Council, said on Bloomberg Television that your report, what comes out of this 90-day period, is going to be the foundation for the Trump administration's trade policy. How much of a blank slate is it at this point?
Well, it's not a blank slate in the sense that there have been trade negotiations and trade analyses historically, but they've never really been all pulled together and put into context. And especially there's never been a real systematic effort to separate some of the natural imports that we have to have and that are not a function of anybody's state subsidy or bad practices. For example, U.S. is not self-sufficient in oil. We have to import oil. So to the degree that a particular country is exporting oil to us, that doesn't mean they're doing anything in the way of an inappropriate trade practice. That's just one example that not all countries in the study will be found to be doing things that are illegitimate or inappropriate. This will be an attempt to develop a pinpointed, fact-based, very methodical, very systematic approach to trade, not a hippity-hop approach, this country, that country, the other countries, scattering all around.
The president very quickly dispatched with the Trans-Pacific Partnership when he took office. Do elements of that trade bill still exist? Are you going to build off of things that were in that document, or have you guys thrown it out whole scale?
Well, there were some improvements that were made in the TPP relative, say, to Nafta and relative to other free trade agreements that we have. So we're obviously not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We view the concessions that were granted in the TPP by those countries as the starting point from which we will attempt to build.
You mentioned the reluctance to go with the hippity-hoppity approach here. Your administration has pushed for a more bilateral approach to trade. How do you square those two things? In other words, developing tenets of trade that are wide-reaching and global, and yet pursuing deals that are two-way?
Well, there's no impediment to developing a set of ingredients that are essential to any trade agreement. It's not inherent in negotiation that you must start every time with a blank sheet of paper. We hope that out of Nafta, which, as you know, is the first thing on our agenda, we hope there'll come some model agreements for some of the components of a trade deal that we can then roll out into other agreements with other countries.
You were on Capitol Hill this week meeting with lawmakers, talking about Nafta in particular. Can you share anything about that conversation, what you discussed with lawmakers on Capitol Hill?
Yes, we're in the process now of negotiating the famous 90-day letter. There's a very highly stylized document that we must present to Congress and they must accept in order to trigger the formal part of the negotiations. That's the process we've been going through. We've had half a dozen meetings with the various committees, the Ways and Means Committee, the House Finance Committee, and the Negotiating Committee, in order to give them a flavor for where the administration would like to head with Nafta. and it was the leakage by the Congress of one of those documents that led to the recent flurry of news about it.
Is the barrier to beginning these conversations on Capitol Hill, or is it in the White House or the Commerce Department? Are you someone who'd like to get started on this as quickly as possible?
Well, it's really in Capitol Hill. Under the Trade Promotion Authority, the so-called fast track, we are not permitted to invoke that and yet not go through the procedures that we're going through right now. So in a formalistic way, it is very much with the Congress, quite specifically with the Senate Finance Committee and with the House Ways and Means Committee. I am anxious to get it started, especially with Mexico, because Mexico has presidential elections coming up in next year. And the closer we get to those elections, the more difficult it will be for any government to make a deal. So I hope we can get going very soon, and I can absolutely assure parties who are involved that the United States will not be a source of delay.
The president has the opportunity to meet with the Chinese president next week. He's not had the opportunity to meet face-to-face since the election with the Mexican president. Can you give us any insight here into the quality of conversations with the Mexican government right now on trade issues in particular?
Well, as I said, we cannot have formal trade negotiations until we get through this 90-day letter. So there are no major discussions underway right now. What we did initiate with our Mexican trading partners is an effort to settle the long-standing dispute over sugar. So we're actively in the negotiation process on that right now, because we can separate that out from the overall Nafta deal. And if we can clear that away, since it's been such a big irritant and around for so long, I think it will bode well for the big negotiations.
Are there particular provisions that are at the top of your list here when you look at NAFTA, things that you want to change, provisions that stand out?
Well, in the letter we sent to the congressional committees, we listed something like 20 areas of negotiation, and then within each of those there are a number of sub-areas. So a trade agreement comes out to be hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages, because it really does go product by product. It does go idea by idea, and every comma and every semicolon is a very important thing.
I imagine that you, like many of us, listened to the speech that the UK Prime Minister Theresa May gave in Parliament earlier this week, perhaps listened to the speech by the EU Council President afterward. Have you been in touch with your counterparts in the United Kingdom since, and what happens next here in terms of how the US and the UK broker a trade deal?
Well, the UK technically cannot negotiate with a third party until they're a lot farther along in the Brexit. Right now, under the rules of the EU is the bargaining agent for them, period. So that's one issue. The second issue, since the UK has not had to do a trade agreement for many, many years, namely since they became part of the EU, they're just staffing up and trying to develop some bandwidth. So I think for the immediate present, they're going to be fairly fully occupied just trying to sort things out with the EU. But we would be eager to engage with them at the earliest possible moment that it's both legally and practically feasible.
I imagine that you're planning some overseas trips. Looking at your itinerary, where are the places you're keen to go to first?
Well, there is a trip scheduled for Japan and South Korea where I will be accompanying Vice President Pence, and that'll be in another few weeks.
We had the pleasure of speaking with Peter Navarro earlier this morning. He's handling some trade issues. You're handling some trade issues. You're waiting, I'm sure, with bated breath for the nominee to be U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer to be confirmed. What do you say to those who look at this as sort of a Cerberus, a three-headed dog of trade policy in the Trump administration, wondering who's directing it? Is that your providence? Who's heading up trade policy for the Trump administration?
Well, the legal responsibility for trade negotiations rests with the United States Trade Representative, and we will be scrupulous to honor the legal system. However, we have explained to the congressional leadership that it's the president's desire and it is the mutual agreement among us that this will be a collaborative effort. We believe that trade is so important and so complex that maximizing the amount of intellectual resources brought to bear on it is the right way to do it. There's no need for turf warfare here.
How handicapped are you, if at all, not having Mr. Lighthizer in place?
Well, Mr. Lighthizer is an old friend. He's a very skilled trade lawyer. He's a very skilled negotiator. So we obviously want very much to have him on board. But that's not going to hold things up. We have the equipment, we have the firepower to negotiate trade deals even without him. We just think it will work even better once he's on board. And we're very, very unhappy that the congressional people, particularly the Democrats, have been slow-walking everything. Take my own case. They slowed my confirmation down by over a month, and yet I wasn't even particularly controversial. I did get 72 votes out of the 90 potential. So there was no real reason for that. They're just being obstructionists, and I think that's unfortunate from the point of view of the nation's best interest.
At this point, is the Commerce Department running on all 8 cylinders? Do you have everyone in place that you need to be in place?
No, we could use more people, and they're at various stages of going through the process for approval. We certainly have enough people in order to function adequately, but to get to our maximum cruising speed, we could use a few more people at some very high positions. But in terms of overall staffing, we do have 47,000 people, so it's hard to say that we're not functioning.
Just a last question to you here. You've known the president for a long time. You count him as a colleague and as a friend. I know that you're a member of Mar-a-Lago as well. I'm sure that you've had conversations with him about trade, what he thinks of trade. Perhaps you could shed some light on the way that he thinks about the issue and how that's leading to him forming policy now that he's the president.
Well, the best summary of it was one he gave me a while back when we were discussing Nafta. He said if we do make it a new trilateral agreement, we should change the spelling, and it should be NAFFTA, namely not just North American Free Trade Agreement, North American Free Fair Trade Agreement. I think that is a very succinct summary of his trade policy.
It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much, Commerce Secretary Ross. Thanks very much for the time.
Enjoying being on with you, Dave.